invitation. I am Lani. I was an ETA in Liberec in 2011, 2012. I taught at the Gymnasium Hieronimova and the Průmyslová škola. And it's an experience that's still very, very close to my heart. I miss Liberec and the Czech Republic very much. After I did my ETA, I did a master's degree where I studied Central and East European studies at the University of Glasgow and Corvinus University of Budapest. And then I moved back to the Czech Republic and I lived in Prague for 4 years. And for almost that whole time, I worked at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, working on history education. So actually, I'm much more comfortable giving a lecture about Czechoslovak history than American. This is a new, well, I think not a totally new experience, because the last time I would have given a lecture about US history was probably my Fulbright year. Now I am studying for my PhD at the University of Helsinki, and I'm studying Czech politics. So I am, of course, American and a great lover of history, but this is by no means my area of expertise, but I hope that I can give you some information and that you will enjoy it and take something from it. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, and before I do so, just to repeat what Christina said, please, if you have any questions during this talk, like feel free to jump in on the chat or just unmute yourself and talk. You're welcome to cut me off. And also tell me, please, if I am speaking too fast, because this is a bad habit of mine. Okay. All right, so I'll enter the presentation mode. I hope you can see me or see the slides now. Okay, so I want to talk about important milestones, like Christina said, or turning points in a multicultural history of the United States. I want to emphasize this is not history the way that I learned it, but over the last several years, it's become clear that we really need to recognize a more multicultural view of American history than many people learned in schools. So that's what I will try to give you here. Okay, so when I say turning point, what do I mean? I mean a major change in the trajectory of events, or some event that marks the end of one thing and the beginning of something new, or in some cases, really just the beginning of something new. And this is a timeline here of kind of all of the things that I aim to discuss here in this talk. We'll see what we get through. Some of these 21st century events might come a little bit late, but we'll see. But yeah, I didn't want to just give you everything like completely. It'll be chronological, but I didn't want to give you kind of just a story of how life was, but rather like the most important moments. So maybe the most important moments to me. So maybe if there's something that catches your interest, you can learn more about that. And a lot of these moments are actually kind of dark ones, but I think this is quite interesting and quite important when considering like how the US is now. We have to look at the darker moments of the like American legacy. How are the problems that America is dealing with right now? How do they tie back to history? What are the historical sources of the problems facing the country right now? So yeah, you're going to hear me talk a lot about racism in particular, but I think this is really important to address right now, especially. Oops. Okay, so let's move in. The American Revolutionary War. So before 1776, the states were colonies of Great Britain. And the main problem that pushed them towards war was that despite the fact that there were no representatives of the colonies in the British Parliament, the Parliament kept imposing taxes on the colonies and making them pay extra for everyday goods, like tea was the famous one. And so there was this famous slogan, no taxation without representation. And maybe you've heard of this kind of famous moment called the Boston Tea Party, where a number of these like patriots, American patriots they would call themselves, kind of ambushed or attacked a ship that came from Britain with tea that they were being taxed for, and threw all of the tea into the Boston harbor. So you can actually go to Boston and see this harbor where where they threw the tea in. And this nowadays is kind of seen as like this moment of the colonists really like showing up and like showing the British that they were like done with all of this, all of the taxation. So this was a moment of early civil disobedience, which definitely comes up later. Of course, that wasn't actually what broke the country away. That was the Declaration of Independence, which they signed, which they wrote and signed in 1776. Of course, July 4th is our Independence Day. This was not actually when the war ended. It was when the war started. So they signed the Declaration of Independence, and then they had to fight in this whole war. And one important thing about the Declaration of Independence was that they didn't just want their own country. They wanted to actually have a totally different system of government. So whereas, of course, Britain was a monarchy with a king and a parliament who is still, I believe, had less power than the king, they wanted to do away with that. The American founding fathers wanted to have a government in which everybody was represented, where all men are created equal, as they said. But of course, when we say that, you have to read into it a little bit, because in declaring that, like, yes, it's an important step. It was the first democracy, the first democratic system. But that all men are created equal, that really just applied to very few people. It applied to only white men, especially who had property. The voting rights didn't extend to everybody. Women, of course, couldn't vote. And of course, there were slaves, and the slaves couldn't vote, nor did they have like really any sort of freedom at all. And so it's a little bit difficult in this light to look at the Declaration of Independence as this kind of crowning important moment for democracy when we know how much was left out of that. And going on with that theme, here, of course, is someone who you may recognize. Here, I'll ask you for a little bit of participation if you're interested. If you want to, in the chat, just write like your first impression of this photos. What words does this bring about for you? Like, can you describe this photo in a couple of words, or this painting in a couple of words? And just write that in the chat. What characteristics do you see? Something. Oops, sorry, I went to the next. Determination, yeah. Willpower, excellent. Anything else? Those are great. Okay, let's stick with that then. Yeah, courage for sure. Thank you, Sharika. Yeah, lots of people, definitely. Okay, feel free to keep jumping in if you want. I'll get rid of the chat for now. But yeah, so this is a famous painting from the 19th century called George Washington Crossing the Delaware. New World, a little bit later from the New World. This was actually during the Revolutionary War. So the world wasn't quite so new anymore, but I guess we can actually still call it that in some circumstances. Yeah, endurance for sure. Perseverance. Yeah, these are all really good ones. And these are all, would we say that there's any sort of negativity here? These all seem to be Yeah, they're fighting against like waves. I think these are icebergs, if you can't quite tell. But yeah, these are all kind of these really positive traits, especially in the American, sure, sacrifice. Especially in the like American eye, these are all seen as really positive things. Endurance, sorry, having trouble with getting out of this chat here. Endurance, perseverance, like fighting through adversity. And this painting, of course, is of George Washington, who's right here. I guess I can kind of, oops, I'm really sorry. I swear I've given Zoom talks before. Yeah, so George Washington. He's a really actually interesting figure, I think more interesting than this painting portrays, because here we really get a very positive view of him. He's leading this huge group of people who are all fighting together. We can see that they all have different types of clothes. I think this is meant to imply that they come from sort of different groups within the colonies. We see the flag, he's right in front of the flag. He's leading the flag even, which is like, of course, a symbol of the country. We can even see a Black man here, like right in front of him. So here we have diversity and we have strength, and all at the front of it is this most important figure who's like standing in the light, and it's George Washington. And actually in most normal, at least the way that I grew up with it, George Washington was never sort of seen as anything but a positive figure. You know, he was the general who won the Revolutionary War. He was the first president. Like, he's the founding father. He is like sort of the very foundation of the country. But he's actually, this is all, like, I don't know when I learned, but I certainly didn't learn it when I was a kid, that he was also a slave owner, which was very normal for a man who was fairly rich like him, living in Virginia like he was. But even as he learned like more about slavery and abolition, the end of slavery, even as people tried to convince him to end slavery, he consciously like decided not to publicly. He was the president. He could have taken a stand, but instead he prioritized keeping the nation together. He thought that if he came out against slavery, then the nation would fall apart. And even after the time when he had decided that he was against slavery, he still owned hundreds of slaves on his plantation, Monticello. Mount Vernon is his, Monticello is Thomas Jefferson. He still owned hundreds of slaves. And even after he had decided he didn't want to have slaves, he freed them in his will. So after he died, and even not only after he died, but after his wife died. Which I think is a little bit, it's hard to say, like, it's hard to give him credit for freeing his slaves if he only did so like when nobody that he cared about would like hurt from this at all. His wife, like, also when he and his wife had slaves who ran away, they tried to chase the slaves down. And so Washington is really not entirely a positive figure when you look at it from this light. And yet it's very difficult to get this image of him sort of accepted, because he has been seen for so many, probably well over 100 years, as only this guy like leading the charge. So yeah, it's these questions that I kind of want to bring up, and I'll watch the time. I guess it's going to go quite quickly. Okay, so let's jump a little bit farther on, but stay here just a little bit farther south than Washington would have been at the time. So of course, if we go back to right when the New World was discovered, we know that the New World was occupied. There were people already living there. These are the Native Americans or the Indians. Both terminology, I think, is still accepted, American Indians or Native Americans. But now, like when I was growing up, the history like of Native Americans seemed to be quite distant. I grew up in North Carolina. You can see this here up in the map. And we didn't learn so much about the people who lived there before the European settlers came. And I think part of this was because of this history that happened in the early 19th century. So in the beginning of the country, like right after the war, when they became independent, the main strategy with how to deal with the Native American tribes there was to force them to assimilate, was to force them to start acting more like white settlers, to stop doing their traditions, to stop wearing their clothes, to act more like the Europeans who had moved in. And this was already like not entirely popular, as you might expect. A lot of them didn't really want to do that, but there was quite a lot of like political will behind it. This was how many politicians had chosen that they wanted to deal with the Native Americans. But then the problem was that the land like got quite productive. There were machines created so that cotton could be grown and harvested faster. And so there was a lot of money to be made on this land. And so the European settlers, the Americans at that point, wanted the Indian land. And so they started like moving on to it and trying to steal it in other ways. And then finally there was this one president called Andrew Jackson, who was very much against the Native American tribes being there. He wanted them gone. And so he signed into power this Indian Removal Act. And that law allowed the white Americans to force Indians to leave their homelands, their tribal lands, and to go elsewhere, as long as the Indians signed a treaty for it. So they couldn't just go, like, they couldn't just be forced out. They had to sign something agreeing to it. But what that would mean is that, you know, they would be promised something, the tribal leaders, like the chiefs, they would agree. And then the rest of the people who didn't necessarily agree would still have to go. So what this amounted to was the forced removal of about 100,000 Native Americans, of whom about at least 13,000, if not more, died along the way. Because you can see these routes, like they were headed out to this reservation area, that little yellow area sort of in the middle of the map. And it was quite a long way. Like right now, here's North Carolina. Can you actually see my cursor moving? I'm not sure. North Carolina is on the east. It takes like, you know, a day of driving to get all the way into Oklahoma, if not more. And so these people were forced like to walk, not in very good conditions and along trails that had been used already by many people. So there weren't animals to hunt, there weren't plants to eat. And so these people died of just like being exposed to the elements for so long. And so one particular of these forced removals of the Cherokee tribe from the Carolinas and Georgia over here was called the Trail of Tears. And they now memorialize it as such. But despite the fact that we know that the Trail of Tears happened, like people are aware of that, like the Native American history of the South after talking about this will be completely absent, basically, from everything else I say about the South. Like the numbers of Native Americans still living there are very low, and it's because they were forced to leave. And so again, this is not pretty history. This is not something that patriotic Americans generally like to kind of own up to, as saying like, yeah, we did this. And think about like how to right this wrong. But I think it's really necessary to remember, like the only reason the South is the way that it is because they kicked out the original inhabitants of it. Okay, now let's jump ahead a little bit to the Civil War. And I'm sorry, my dog is like walking back and forth. And so if you can hear him, I apologize. He's distracting me a little bit. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation. I think this is probably the most important moment of the Civil War. And therefore this is the turning point that I want to focus on here. So when Abraham Lincoln was elected, he promised that, or he was very anti-slavery. And so the slave states of the South, whose economy was like very dependent on slaves running all of the plantations, they decided that they didn't want to risk staying as a part of the country when Abraham Lincoln became president. And the reason for that, like I said, was the economy, but it was also very, very clearly racist. When the Confederacy broke away, when these 11 states decided that they wanted to form their own country rather than being part of the previously created United States, part of the main ideology was just this line right here. And I want you to take a moment, I'll read through it, but also just take a moment to really, to look at the words here. I guess it's a bit more complicated, but still, this is actually what the vice president of the Confederacy said as part of the reason why the Confederacy had to be formed. The great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. So I think it's important to tell you this because sometimes this is still a problem in schools, sometimes in the South, where, and not only schools, like people will make this claim, that actually the Confederacy and the Civil War, it wasn't about slavery, it wasn't about race, it was about states' rights. And this is something you hear very, very often. This is a very contested moment in American history, that the Civil War was only about states' rights, nothing, like slavery had nothing to do with it. But you don't have to dig very far to see that actually sorry, that was my email ping, that the one state right they were concerned with was actually the right to own slaves. And the reason for that was not just the economy, but it was also because of this actual belief that Black people were not equal to white people. And this isn't to say that everybody in the Union was not racist, but they at least at that point believed that slavery should not exist anymore as an institution. So when the Civil War began in 1961, this was a pretty even fight, with the Union fighting from the northern states and the Confederacy fighting, that was the southern states. But then with the Emancipation Proclamation, this was an order that Lincoln signed in 1862, and it officially freed all of the slaves in the Confederacy. So what that meant, it didn't mean that the slaves in the Union were free. In order to end slavery in the Union, Lincoln had to get a constitutional amendment passed, which is a longer process, which he started at that point. But with the Emancipation Proclamation, that was just like, he signed a piece of paper saying that the slaves were free. And according to Union laws, they were free. This meant that if they could escape into the Union, then they would be safe. This meant that they could join the Union Army. Some did. And it gave sort of much more power to the Union cause. And so, at least from what I've read, and again, this isn't totally my area of expertise, it looks like this proclamation was an important part of how the Union actually ended up winning the war. That fighting continued until 1865, and it was, sorry, just looking at my notes. It was up until the Vietnam War, it was the deadliest conflict in American history. On both, just considering that people from both sides who were dying were American. But as we're going to go on to talk about, even though the Union won the war and the Confederate States eventually rejoined the Union, agreeing not to have slavery in their states, this is still kind of a core, what would happen next, it still forms the core problem of systematic racism that is plaguing the entire country still today. So Reconstruction. After the Civil War was lost by the Confederacy kind of began to morph from this actual existing thing that lost a war into this kind of mythical mythical cause. And so it turned, I've written here, from the Confederacy into the lost cause. And for people who still have sort of Confederate sympathies now, they'll often refer to it this way, that it was the lost cause, and that's why they still have to keep it alive. Can anyone take a guess in the chat at what this picture is? Maybe you were following the news earlier this year. It's okay if you have no idea. Yeah, a Confederate general, Sharka, guesses? I'm not sure if it was technically a general or just a Confederate soldier, but anyway, this is, before I talk about what else I have here, I'll use this as a sort of symbol. So in the period after the Civil War, the Southern states kind of still tried to mark themselves out as being connected to the Confederacy. And so many of them, like in the remainder of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, they put up these either like statues of Confederate generals. I believe that this was just like a memorial to the Confederate soldiers. And this was actually the Confederate statue that was in my hometown of Durham, North Carolina, that was pulled down over the summer by protesters. And the reason that they put up these statues, like, yes, nominally, the point was to like remember those who had fought for that lost cause. But sort of more symbolically, the point of these statues was to show the people who live there that this is who we want to memorialize. We don't want to remember the other side of the Civil War. We want to remember the people who wanted to keep slavery. And so even though they won't say that outright, like the fact that these statues have existed here in the Southern here, have existed there in the Southern states, like up until 2020, I think is an important thing to note. So going back to the 19th century, the Confederate States rejoined the Union. They had to sign the amendment agreeing not to have any slaves. And eventually Black men were also fully considered to be American citizens, and they were also given the right to vote. Still, of course, women can't vote, but at least Black men are given the right to vote. The Southern states at that point were left in a very difficult situation because the Union armies had destroyed the roads, the bridges, many buildings. And so not only was their economy in ruins, especially with no slave labor, they had to now pay for their labor, imagine that, but also they had to rebuild all of this infrastructure. And they're dealing with the fact that in this country that was like heavily racist, that they now have to give rights to the people who they believe are below them. And so what happened over the next many decades was that many of these Southern states kind of put up roadblocks in the way of former slaves actually like getting the same rights as white people in the Southern states. So they made it more difficult for them to vote. They, for example, would levy a poll tax, like force them to pay something to vote, or force them to pass like a test, like a reading test or something like that. Sorry, I've got a very whiny dog. And this would often make it impossible. Like if you were a slave, it's very unlikely that you would have learned how to read. And so in that case, you wouldn't be allowed to vote, despite the fact that a white person who couldn't read, also fairly common at the time, would have no problem going to vote. It was also more difficult for them to get healthcare. It was more difficult for them to own property. It's not like they were let free from being a slave and then given some, starter house and job. Like they had to build this from the bottom up. And so when people talk about systemic racism now, this is always in the news, always in the political sphere nowadays. This was the very beginning of it. The fact that all of these things were much harder for the former slaves, this kind of sets itself up and then compounds, like gets more and more difficult and a bigger and bigger problem over the generations. And the country is only now in the process of addressing it. And so I'm calling this Reconstruction period a turning point because it really was a chance for the former slaves to get out on the right footing. And the northern states were pushing for like different legislation for things to open up for the former slaves, but that's not what happened. Like the people who would have supported the Confederacy stayed in control in the South. And so while there was no more slavery, you still were left with a very big problem. And so basically, instead of going up at that point, it still like continued to go down. I mean, rights for the former slaves. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, great. So again, we're going to jump ahead very quickly. I'm not going to talk at all about the early 20th century. I'm not going to talk about World War I or the Great Depression, or even actually that much about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I think is another important character. We are going to go straight to the event that brought the US into World War II. So that was the attack on Pearl Harbor. But as I'm sure that you all well know, World War II started a couple years before the US joined, before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But the US was still kind of in a state where they didn't really want to join what was still seen as a foreign war. Roosevelt at that point didn't want to jump in because the going like opinion about this was that like World War I had been one thing, but they were still kind of recovering from that 20 years later after the Great Depression and everything. And so the idea of jumping into another European war, that's how it was seen, was not a popular one. However, in 1941, on December 7th, everything changed. This is what Roosevelt called a day that will live in infamy. And that's when the Japanese came and attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. There's one interesting thing I want to bring up. The US, as you probably know, is a conspiracy theory loving country. And one of the more interesting ones for me as a person who likes history a lot is the idea that Roosevelt and many of the other American and British like higher ups, like military officials, might have known that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, but they didn't stop it because they secretly wanted the US to enter the war. And a lot of people have gone and disproven this conspiracy theory. I really think it is a conspiracy theory. But you can also see why people would think this way, because at the time in 1941, the British, who were, of course, the US's like main allies against Germany and Italy in Europe, was really struggling. And apparently when Winston Churchill talked to Roosevelt right after the Pearl Harbor attacks, he was actually happy because he knew that at that point, that meant that the US was going to get involved in the war. And he thought that that would help their cause. And so actually, just when I was preparing for this presentation, I saw a quote from him that was like, at that moment, I knew we had won the war. And that point, of course, is still almost 4 years away, but it was the beginning. The US declared war against the Axis powers and against Germany and Japan, and then they jumped straight into the war. The picture over here, of course, is not a wartime, well, it is a wartime picture, but it's not from one of the normal theaters of war. This is another like piece of nasty history that the US has to reckon with. And that is the Japanese internment camps. So after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, this left the Japanese immigrants and the descendants of Japanese immigrants in a difficult situation in the States, because they thought, like the authorities thought that, just because these people have a connection to Japan, it means that they're not fully American, and this makes them kind of a danger. And so instead of, excuse me, instead of just letting them go about their lives, they actually rounded the Japanese people up and transported them into these internment camps. So basically, the idea of these camps was just that they wanted to keep the Japanese people in one place. They weren't like forced work camps or anything like that. They are not parallel with the concentration camps in Central and Eastern Europe. But it's still a really unpleasant moment in history for Americans to face, because the whole thing, and this has often been a problem with immigrant groups, this perception that they're not loyal to us, they're still loyal to them, they're still loyal to their home. And so when Japan became this great enemy, there was this fear that Japanese people would also be a great enemy. Whereas, of course, the grand majority of these people were not born in Japan. They were born in the US. They were as American as I am. And yet they were transported to these camps, forced to leave their homes and schools with their families, to leave their work, and to go to these internment camps. This is actually a moment that has been sort of addressed. The state of California, for example, has apologized officially for the Japanese internment camps. So there's nothing being done, but it's still an important thing to learn about, that we were not only heroes in World War II. But yeah, I think this is still an interesting question to ask. Was Winston Churchill right to be so excited when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Would the Allies have won World War II without the US? And I think Americans, we have this idea that of course not, they could never have won without the US. And from World War II onwards, basically, this is when America stopped being isolationist. Then the US started taking part in many, many disputes abroad. That was the last time they held back so much as before that happened. Okay, so 1968, again, jumping forward quite a lot. This is, I know, a year that you're familiar with for your own reasons. But it's also an important moment in the US. It was a very, very tense year, like for many reasons across the country. There was a presidential election going on, for one thing. And the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, had decided not to run again because he was very unpopular because of the whole issue with the Vietnam War. Johnson was like keeping the country involved. There was a lot of activism against the Vietnam War. Of course, the civil rights movement was going on. So this was the fight for Black people's rights primarily, where they were trying to push off all of these rules that had been put in place during the Jim Crow era and the Reconstruction era. Sorry, Jim Crow was like a very racist era in the South, basically, to put it shortly. But amidst all of these, and so like with all of these tensions running so high in politics and with the civil rights movement, this actually boiled over, and we had a couple of really important assassinations. The first, I'm sure you've heard about before, was Martin Luther King, who was a major civil rights campaigner and a reverend. He was a nonviolent activist, and here, this was his final speech given at the Washington Monument, after which he was assassinated. And it's crazy actually to me to think that he was like 36 or 38 or something when he was killed. I'm not even that much younger than him anymore. He like, he was actually he would only, he would be a fairly old man right now, but he would have had a long life ahead of him. He's often seen as sort of a figure who, because we celebrate him now, then surely the civil rights movement has succeeded and it's over. But actually, that's, as we know, really, really not the case. There's still a lot of racism to be fought. And while his was an important voice, he in no way marks an end. The other important assassination was Robert Kennedy. He was one of the Kennedy brothers, that same family as John F. Kennedy, who had also been assassinated earlier in the 60s. But this was part of Democratic politics. He was running for president, and it totally upended the entire election when he was killed. And so now he has turned into this kind of liberal icon, like what could have been with Robert Kennedy. And so that's now two in the same year, like what could have been with Martin Luther King or with Robert Kennedy. And the winner of that election ended up being Richard Nixon, who I won't talk about anymore, but he is a bit of a crooked character. And then finally, the last thing I want to bring up, I would say this is in the same kind of thread of upheaval that we saw in 68. This was actually in 69 in the summer, were the Stonewall riots. Definitely something that I didn't learn in school, but a very important moment. This was seen as sort of the beginning. It's a false beginning, but it was really the public beginning of the fight for LGBTQ plus equality. So the Stonewall riots were when in the summer of 1969, there were only very, very, very few places where LGBTQ people could go and be publicly LGBTQ. So where you could go and make it obvious that you were gay, there were very few people, or places, sorry. And one of these places was a bar owned by the mafia in New York City called Stonewall. And there were these kind of places dotted in cities across the country. But otherwise, like LGBTQ people had to be like very, very quiet about their identities. And the fight for their equality, like it had been going on for a long time, but this is where it became public because police raided the bar, and then actually the people who were there and people like outside in the street joined in fighting against the New York City police. And so it ended up lasting for several days of rioting. And this was the moment where, like, after that, you finally started to see public organizations for LGBTQ civil rights. And I would say, unlike the Black civil rights movement and unlike the fight to dismantle systemic racism, the fight for LGBTQ equality has been very successful in a very short time. Obviously, there is still work to be done in terms of prejudice, but it's more normal. It's very normal in most places in the States now for you to see people like living publicly and like being visibly LGBTQ in ways that you wouldn't have seen it before. Like, for example, now there is I forget what her actual position is, but there's a trans woman in a very high level position in Biden's Department of Health. And that's a really huge step because trans people's rights have been trampled on in the Trump administration. And so just the fact that they're like doing this big turnaround kind of proves how much more normal it is for people to be publicly LGBT. So yeah, I would say this is more of a success, but again, there's still a ways to go because the Trump administration still happened. Okay, so now we're getting into the 21st century. I know I've been skipping over quite a lot, but again, I wanted to give you these highlights. And now this one, of course, is a highlight that I actually remember, low light maybe. But anyway, the September 11th attacks. This is a point where I think anybody who witnessed it, we all remember it 100%. Like, I can tell you exactly where I was and what I was doing and how I found out about the attacks, like what happened that whole day, basically. And there's a real sense of how there was a before the September 11th attacks and after. Life really changed. Like, security became much more of a focus. Like, it's hard to imagine kind of, storylines in old movies and TV shows where you could go meet somebody at the gate of an airport. Like, you could never do that anymore, of course. And it's all because of the September 11th. But more importantly, it was the most fatal foreign attack ever on American soil. It led to 2 wars, one of which is only like just maybe ending, not entirely, in Afghanistan. And I said in the outline that it was kind of, in the early 90s, the historian Francis Fukuyama said that it was the end of history when communism fell in Central and Eastern Europe. And now this was, I think, kind of the end of history. It was clear that the Cold War ending was not actually like the beginning of this beautiful, liberal democratic utopia. There's actually, things are still going on. People still have disagreements. And what this really punctured was this sense of sort of American infallibility, or like American, like it suddenly became clear that like, oh, maybe actually some people don't like us. Maybe actually we're not these heroes always. And then of course we go and start 2 wars in the Middle East, which also led to people thinking worse of Americans. So yeah, this was a major and very important turning point just now in the 21st century. And now if I have a couple more minutes, I'll take you to some people who I'm sure that you recognize. This is territory that I'm a bit more comfortable talking about because political science is what I study, but American politics is what I can't help myself from following every single day. And so just to tie together these threads that I've been talking about before, especially with the themes of racism, it was seen as a huge success, as sort of the end of racism when Barack Obama was elected president. If anybody really believed that at the time, it was certainly proven to them that to be false in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president. There's a Black writer called Ta-Nehisi Coates who wrote a really, really excellent article called "The First White President," referring to Donald Trump. And many people saw Trump's election as a real backlash against Obama, not only against his policies, but against the fact that he was Black. Not that they were going to say that out loud, and not that Donald Trump said that out loud, of course. But he, from the very beginning, made it very clear that it was okay to dislike other people. He made it very clear that it was okay to dislike immigrants, that it was okay to insult people, and to use these sort of, we say dog whistles, where you say something that is racist but is not like verbally explicitly racist. I see some things in the chat. I'll just look here. The name, oh yes, the name of the author. And I believe it was in the Atlantic, this article. But yeah, really, really excellent article if you want to read that. Yes. Get rid of that. Yeah. So yeah, Donald Trump made it okay for people to use these dog whistles, for racism to be such a prominent force in US politics, even though they wouldn't have said outwardly that it was so. And now, of course, we know that now that Biden has been elected, there's a lot that he will fix, I hope, or anyway, he will try. But these feelings that Trump supporters have aren't simply going to go away. And so Trump's election really uncovered and exposed a lot of the problems that America's facing. I think that right now, for everyone watching, certainly myself included, it's a much more tense situation than I've ever witnessed before, including the 2001 period. There's so much disagreement. It's so heavily polarized. And, these are the figures who are so prominent now. And like, it's just night and day, they stand for such totally different things. And so I'm sorry that I can't give you like an optimistic finish to this talk about American history, because I think right now we're at such a tough point. And for a lot of us, it's difficult to see the way out, it's difficult to see how Biden can bring back together like the people who supported Obama and the people who supported Trump. But I hope that he will try. And I hope also that I have given you something interesting to work with here in this talk. I think now it's time for me to wrap it up and open the floor to you guys. I am happy to answer any questions. And this is my dog who is walking around and whining for half of this lecture. But thank you so much for your attention. Should I stop sharing my screen? You're very welcome, Martin. Okay, I'll stop the share so that now I can be part of like the whole Zoom call.
Thank you very much, Lani. This was excellent. I encourage everyone in the audience to think and type any questions you have into the chat window. I will also insert the link for your presentation and your outline so that everyone can have it. If you have a question, feel free to use the chat or unmute yourselves.
Yes, you're all very welcome. I see these thank yous. And thank you. I agree. He's a very cute dog. History fact sources. Like, do you mean specific books or? Yes, I'm very happy for Biden. Cautiously optimistic. Like, Linda, do you have any like specific sort of thing that you're looking for? Okay. Yes, there are a ton of books. There's one biographer, Ron Chernow, who's written some really good biographies of like presidents and important people, especially from the early Americas. Sorry, I feel put on the spot. Can I get back to you? Like, could I take some time and then send you some recommendations? This is always my weakness when someone asks me like, oh, what is that word in English, or what is that thing? Then my mind is completely blank.
We can share the resources in the shared folder we have together with the outline and the presentation. So we may add a slide with some of recommended resources. That's a good idea. And thank you for the question.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yes, I think that many of us are. That's a relief.
So today, it looks like there are not as many questions as usually. Maybe the reason is that Lani's presentation was quite rich, quite maybe a little bit heavier. Yeah. But I think that's good because we try to balance the life lessons with some that are more, let's say, traditional, and others that are non-traditional. And this certainly was a non-traditional view that many of us did not learn in English language textbooks in the Czech Republic, at least based on my own experience.
No, I would be quite surprised if you had. If I didn't learn it in school, why would you have?
If you still have questions, please use the chat. But if you don't, that's totally okay as well. Let me just remind you that we will continue with these Fulbright life lessons in February. And the February theme will be US literature. We also have two remarkable presenters for that month. It will be on February the 15th with Katie Borden, who taught at Gymnasium in Děčín. And then on February 17th, there will be a lecture by an American author and English literature professor, David Hicks, who also will share his view at modern American literature. So mark your calendars. And if you have questions, feel free to ask.
I see one more question. My opinion about, I assume you're referring to Kamala Harris, would be Miss Harris, not Mrs., because she didn't take her husband's name. But anyway, small thing. Yeah, I'm thrilled to have Miss Harris as the vice president. I think she was a great option. I maybe would have voted for her for president if she had still been in the running when the election came around, but she was not. So yeah, thrilled to have a woman in the White House finally. But yeah, thank you for the question. And thanks again for all of your attention.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Lani. This was great. I enjoyed it myself a lot. We had many more people watching on Facebook as well. Thank you everyone for your participation. We look forward to seeing you soon. I am, as usual, sharing the link for your feedback. So please spare 2 or 3 minutes of your time and share your opinion on today's presentation. And if there are any teachers among the audience, I would like to highlight that the Fulbright Commission invites applicants for a training program in the US. You can apply for Teacher Excellence and Achievement Program to study media literacy and critical thinking in the United States until the end of March. So if you're interested, take a look at our website or follow us on Facebook. And I think that will be it from us for today. So thank you very much and bye-bye.